We're back in Morning Joe speaking with Jonathan Swan of Axios, talking about his interview with presidential senior advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner. Here is Kushner defending his close relationship with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman as one between the U.S. and a long-term ally.
How many conversations have you had with Mohammed bin Salman about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi?
Yeah, again, the discussions I have with whether it's individual Palestinians or with world leaders or with other people, I keep those discussions to myself. The people who need to know about them in our government, it's related to the jobs that they're doing, they know about those discussions.
The Senate has unanimously said that Mohammed bin Salman ordered it. The CIA briefed members of the Senate who voted that way. I don't know what the administration's waiting for in terms of accountability.
I believe that there's a report that they're working on. They've been doing an investigation, and when they have the facts of the investigation, then it'll be up to the president to make a determination on what he wants to do.
Mr. President, are you willing to say that MBS is responsible for Khashoggi's death?
When did this come up again? What are you back? Are you back?
Talk to Axios.
Are you back? What? 4 months ago? No.
Nope, just a couple of minutes ago, Jared Kushner talking to Jonathan Swan of Axios is what the question was about, Jonathan. So Jared Kushner, does he place any blame on the Crown Prince for the death of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi?
If he does, he won't say it publicly, and he defend's probably the wrong word. I would just say more deflected. He talked about the importance of countering Iran, which he's done before. I really tried to push him back. We've heard him say that before, fulsomely in interviews he's done before, explaining the strategic justification of the relationship with Saudi Arabia. I think everyone understands that. What I tried to do was to narrow it to Mohammed bin Salman, this leader that this White House has invested a lot in, that they've promoted as a great reformer, and that have not reckoned with some of the things that he's done, whether it be ordering the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, whether it be kidnapping the Lebanese prime minister, or the way the Saudis have conducted the war in Yemen. So, again, I tried to get him to reckon with that. He very much punted on the Khashoggi situation. He said that the State Department is still investigating, and when they come to conclusions, then, they'll have more to say.
David Ignatius, time and again, the Trump White House, not just Jared Kushner, has downplayed the Crown Prince's role in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. This contradicts the CIA. It's not just a press report. It's nothing that is just out in the atmosphere. The CIA has concluded that MBS was behind the death of Jamal Khashoggi. So how can Jared Kushner sit there and sort of shrug his shoulders and not at least confirm what the intelligence agencies have told him and told this White House?
It's shocking to me. Khashoggi was my colleague and friend, as you know, yeah. When I watched Kushner in that cold-blooded way, dismiss it, pretend it doesn't matter. I don't like to watch that. I'll just know one interesting thing. Kushner may ignore this. President Trump may wave away a question shouted from a reporter, but I'm told that our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has said repeatedly to Mohammed bin Salman, you have to make changes. You have to get rid of the people who counseled you to conduct this murder and many other operations in Saudi Arabia to harass dissidents. And MBS to this day hasn't done it. There's a key senior official, Saad al-Qahtani, who I'm told has not been in any effective way arrested for his alleged role in this. And MBS just keeps blowing off, among others, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. That's how confident, maybe arrogant, he seems to feel.
And just building on what David said, the problem goes beyond the murder of Khashoggi, though that's bad enough. The whole premise of the administration's policy is that MBS and Saudi Arabia are one of our two principal partners in a critical part of the world. And I would just think this murder and the aftermath, what they've done in Yemen, the arrest of the Lebanese prime minister, the isolation of Qatar, it's a long list. It just raises fundamental questions about our future U.S. Middle East policy, whether essentially by giving unconditional support to this country, whether we've put an awful lot of our fate in the hands of someone who simply hasn't demonstrated anything like the decision-making skills and maturity that we would want. And so I wonder as much about that as I do about this unwillingness to face up to this crime.
Richard, what I wonder about, and I'll speculate, and maybe you'll agree or not, but based on the behavior of Jared Kushner's relationship with MBS, it seems as though something else is going there. Kushner has business dealings. The Saudis are involved in business dealings. And I wonder, and as I think many Americans do, is Jared Kushner conducting the business of the United States or conducting the business of Jared Kushner?
Look, I don't know the answer to that, and that's not just about him. There's any number of people in this administration. There's a front page story today about Elaine Chao and whether she's commingling business with her job. For all I know, there's also a desire to somehow win over the Saudis because they're going to supposedly deliver the Palestinians, what we were talking about 5 minutes ago. All I know is they are a flawed vessel in which to put so much of our hopes for a part of the world that still matters given oil.
And he seemed to initiate this contact because the first presidential visit was to Saudi Arabia.
Exactly, from the get-go. They have been at the center of things. And again, I think a lot of it was to try to normalize relations with Israel and transform the region. And it just isn't going well. Indeed, when I meet with Middle East analysts, which is something I do for a living, a lot of them have fundamental doubts about the long-term stability of Saudi Arabia.
Anousheh, I want to go back to MBS and Khashoggi for a minute because we need to nail this down and be clear about what Jared Kushner is dismissing here. The CIA reached the conclusion that MBS was behind this, and in fact, Gina Haspel, the CIA director, in December briefed a group of United States senators. Lindsey Graham, who has supported the President of the United States on just about everything, called the evidence he saw that day, quote, a smoking saw. There was no doubt in his mind or of anybody who's seen the intelligence who was behind the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
Well, I think it says the relationship between this administration and U.S. intelligence agencies, unfortunately, isn't as strong as it has been in the past with past White House administrations. But I also think it's important what this says about the U.S. stance of press freedom around the world. I mean, I was born and raised in Bangladesh, and when I was growing up, the U.S. regularly sent election monitors. They monitored our press freedoms, and that was something we were rebuked on if they thought that, press freedom was something that wasn't being honored. What does this say? The fact that this administration can't possibly rebuke Saudi Arabia, but even come out with a clear statement. I mean, we're waiting for this report that the Saudis are supposed to give on Khashoggi's murder that is being overseen by MBS and his own people. So it's all really unsettling, and it's going to leave a terrible legacy for America and America's protection of press freedoms around the world.
As we said, Jonathan Swan covered an awful lot of ground with Jared Kushner. Here's their exchange about the 2016 Trump Tower meeting that's gotten so much attention, including in the Mueller report.
On June the 8th, 2016, you were sent an email with an offer of help for the Trump campaign from the Russian government.
I'm sorry, which email are you talking about?
The email from Ron Goldstone.
Look, Jonathan.
No. My question to you is, why didn't you pick up the phone and call the FBI? It was an email that said Russia, that said the Russian government was trying to help. Why didn't you do that?
Jonathan, we're in a place now where people are playing Monday morning quarterback and they're being so self-righteous. Let me put you in my shoes at that time, okay? I'm running 3 companies. I'm helping run the campaign. I get an email that says show up at 4 instead of 3 to a meeting that I'd been told about earlier that I didn't know what the hell it was about. Okay, I show up at the meeting. I stay for 15 minutes. It's a clown show. 1 second. No, let me finish this. I text my assistant and say, can you give me a call to get me the hell out of here? This is a waste of time. I leave. I never would have thought about that meeting again. Okay, had there been something that actually was nefarious at that meeting that came up, maybe we would have done something different. But the reality is that the meeting was a total waste of time.
Would you call the FBI if it happened again?
I don't know. It's hard to do hypotheticals, but the reality is that we were not given anything that was salacious.
Wow. Jonathan Swan, I have 2 questions for you. One, did they learn nothing from the Mueller situation, this investigation, as to the substance of his answer there, as saying he's not sure if he would call the FBI? But secondly, I'm not sure what order we've played a lot of these sound bites in. He seemed very testy in that answer. I mean, is that how you kind of wrapped up the interview? It was a tough ride for him.
So with that question, obviously there was a lot of speculation before the Mueller report came out that Jared Kushner was going to be indicted, and he wasn't indicted. And ultimately, I think when the report came out, my understanding is he felt pretty good about it. I only had that one question because he was on that email trail for that meeting, and it did explicitly say the Russian government was offering help, and it had Russia in the subject line. So I wanted to know whether he grasped the seriousness of it and whether he would call the FBI if it happened again. And I'll admit, I was surprised by the answer. Look, it was that section got a little bit testy. That wasn't how the interview ended. It ended with me, if you watch the full episode, with me asking him about Donald Trump's legacy, and he sort of lays out the two big things that he thinks the president will be remembered for: changing the people that come to Washington and America's place in the world. Look, we went through we covered a lot of ground in that interview. We covered Israeli-Palestinian peace deal. We covered his own family history of refugees. We covered Russia. We covered some of the controversies that have, occurred during his time in the White House, and some other big picture things. So there was a lot of ground in that interview.
By the way, FBI Director Christopher Wray offered helpful advice in recent congressional testimony when he said, in the future, if a foreign government calls you or if a foreign entity reaches out to help you, call the FBI. National political reporter for Axios, Jonathan Swan. Remarkable interview with Jared Kushner. Thanks so much. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Coming up this morning, last week, President Trump said it was, quote, fake news that the White House requested the USS John McCain be moved out of sight during his recent trip to Japan. But his acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, is not denying that it happened and said the request was, quote, not an unreasonable thing to ask. We'll show you Mulvaney's new comments ahead on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.